Clara had read the letter twice before she folded it. The second time didn't tell her anything the first time hadn't already said, but she read it again anyway, the way a person touches a bruise to confirm it's real. The letter was from a man named Elias Calloway, written in the careful hand of someone who chose words the way a rancher chooses fence posts for function, not beauty. He needed someone capable. He had 4 sons. The ranch was in Harlan County, Montana, 3 days by rail from where she was standing in her aunt's kitchen in Cheyenne, Wyoming, with nothing behind her but a closed door and nothing ahead of her but this piece of paper. She was 24 years old. She packed 1 trunk. The train ride north gave her 3 days to reconsider, and she spent all 3 of them watching the land change outside the window, the flat, pale gold of Wyoming giving way to the deeper greens of Montana, the mountains rising up slow and certain, like something the earth had been meaning to say for a long time. It was 1,901. The cattle drives were mostly finished. The open range was being fenced in sections. The West that men had written songs about was closing itself down quietly, like a general store at the end of a long day, and something else was starting, though nobody had given it a name yet. She arrived in the town of Dillon on a Thursday afternoon when the light was going amber and the dust on the main street hung still in the air. A man was waiting beside a wagon. He was taller than she'd expected, with a beard that had gone partly gray at the jaw and hands that looked like they'd spent 20 years arguing with the land. He held his hat in front of him and nodded once when he saw her come down the platform steps. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Calloway," she said. That was the full extent of their introduction. He took her trunk and set it in the wagon bed without asking, and she climbed up to the bench without being offered help, and they rode the 11 miles to the ranch in the kind of silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either. It was simply the silence of 2 people who did not yet know what they were to each other. The ranch was called the Double C. It sat in a wide valley with mountains to the north and a river cutting through the lower pasture, silver and cold even in September. There was a barn that needed paint, a bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands slept, and a main house built from timber that had weathered to the color of old pewter. It was not a beautiful place, but it was a serious one. Clara could see that right away the way serious was different from cold, the way a place could be demanding without being cruel. The 4 boys were waiting on the porch when the wagon came in. The oldest was 17, and his name was Henry. He had his father's height already and his father's expression neutral, watchful, not unfriendly but not open either. Beside him stood Thomas, who was 14, and who looked at Clara the way a boy looks at something he's already decided he doesn't like. The 2 youngest were twins, Robert and James, who were 9 years old and who stood close together the way twins do, like one creature with 2 faces, and who stared at her with wide, careful eyes. Elias Calloway said, "Boys, this is Miss Holt. She'll be taking care of the house." Nobody said welcome. Thomas turned and went inside. Henry gave a short nod. The twins kept staring. Clara picked up the bag she'd carried herself and walked up the porch steps and went through the front door into the house that was not hers. And she set her bag down in the room off the kitchen, small, clean, smelling of cedar and old wood. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to find where they kept the flour. The first 2 weeks were the longest of her life, and she had once spent 6 weeks nursing her mother through a fever winter. The house had not been managed by a woman's hand in 4 years, since Elias's wife, Margaret, had died of pneumonia the winter the youngest boys were 5. In that time, the house had developed the particular kind of order that men create in the absence of women. Everything functional, nothing considered. The curtains were wrong for the light. The wood stove drew poorly because nobody had cleaned the pipe. The pantry was organized by size of container rather than by use, which meant the salt was behind the molasses and the coffee was behind the beans, and every morning was a small archaeology project. Clara did not complain about any of it. She simply started changing things, one at a time, quietly, the way water changes a riverbank, not by force but by persistence, Thomas noticed. Thomas always noticed, and whatever he noticed, he resented. He was 14, and he had been the one who'd kept the pantry organized by size, and he didn't like finding it different. He said things at the table that weren't quite rude but sat right at the edge of it. Comments about the way she cooked the beans or the fact that she'd moved the woodpile to the south side of the house. He never looked at her directly when he said them. He said them to the middle distance, which was somehow worse. Elias said nothing when Thomas did this. Clara was not sure whether this was because he didn't notice or because he agreed, and for a while she couldn't tell which possibility bothered her more. Henry was easier, or at least less difficult. He treated her with the formal courtesy of a young man who had been raised to have manners and intended to keep them regardless of circumstance. He said please and thank you. He did not speak to her beyond necessity, but he was never unkind. She came to think of him as a closed door, not locked, just closed, and she did not try to open it. The twins were the strangest case. Robert and James had taken the position, apparently by mutual and unspoken agreement, of simply watching her. They watched her make biscuits. They watched her mend a fence post that had come loose on the garden gate. They watched her read in the evenings by the lamp, their two faces appearing at the doorway to the sitting room like a pair of owls. They did not speak to her, but they did not leave either. There was something in this that she thought might eventually become something else, if she was patient enough. She was good at patient. She had been practicing it most of her life. The thing that was hardest was Elias. Not because he was unkind. He was not unkind. He said good morning when he came in from the barn, and good night when he went up the stairs, and thank you when she put his supper in front of him. And he ate everything she cooked without complaint, which she had come to understand was its own form of compliment in a man like him. But he was somewhere else, even when he was in the room. His eyes would rest on something she couldn't see, and his jaw would set, and she understood that she was looking at a man who had built a wall around himself so long ago that he'd stopped noticing it was there. She learned his patterns. He was up before dawn every morning. He drank his coffee black and standing up at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn. He came in at noon only if something required it. Otherwise, he ate in the field. He was back at the house by supper, and he sat at the head of the table, and he talked to his sons about the ranch, the cattle, the fences, the weather with a brisk and quiet efficiency that told her he thought of the table as a working meeting rather than a family meal. On the third Saturday after her arrival, she put wildflowers in a jar on the table. She'd found them by the river that morning, small yellow ones she didn't know the name of, and something in her had wanted to bring them in. Elias sat down that evening, looked at the jar, and looked away. He didn't say anything. She was not sure why this landed as hard as it did. That night, after the boys had gone up, and the dishes were done, and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote a letter to her friend back in Cheyenne, and found herself unable to say anything true about how she felt. So she wrote about the mountains instead, and the way the river sounded at night, and she went to bed without sending it. The storm came in the second week of October, which was early even for Montana. It came from the northwest, the way the bad ones do, and by the time anyone could read it clearly, it was already over the mountains and moving fast. Elias rode in from the upper pasture at 4 in the afternoon, with his coat dark from rain and his expression darker, and he went straight to the barn to get the horses in. Henry went with him. Thomas was already somewhere on the property, nobody knew exactly where. Clara went to find him. She didn't stop to put on her coat. She went out the back and called his name into the wind and got nothing back, and so she walked to the south field, where she'd seen him earlier that morning fixing a section of wire fence, and he was still there, crouched in the grass, not fixing anything anymore, just sitting with his back against a post in the rain with his knees up and his arms across his knees and his face turned down. She walked up and stood beside him and did not say anything for a moment. He said, without looking up, "I don't need help." "I know," she said. She stood there anyway, the rain coming down on both of them, and after a long moment he said, "She used to come find me too, when things were bad." He paused. "My mother." Clara did not say anything. "I'm not trying to be cruel to you," he said. It came out rough, like something he'd been keeping under pressure. "I just don't know how to do this, having someone else here, in her place." "I'm not in her place," Clara said. "Nobody is in her place. I'm just in the house." He looked up at her then for the first time in 2 weeks. 14 years old, and already so tired in the eyes. They walked back to the house together in the rain. She made hot cocoa. She'd found a tin of it in the back of the pantry, behind the molasses, and she put 2 mugs on the table, and he sat across from her, and they didn't talk much. But it was a different kind of silence than before. A smaller one that had a little air in it. When Elias came in from the barn an hour later and found them at the table, he stopped in the kitchen doorway with rain on his coat and looked at the two of them and at the mugs and at Thomas, who was not exactly smiling, but whose face had loosened from whatever it had been before. Elias looked at Clara. She couldn't read his expression. He nodded once and went to hang up his coat. But before he turned away, she saw something move in his face. Just briefly, something that had not been there before. November came in clean and cold. The twins had decided, at some point she hadn't noticed, to start talking to her. It began with Robert asking her what she was writing in her notebook, and spiraled from there into a daily inquiry that covered, over the following weeks, every topic a 9-year-old considers urgent, whether bears hibernated in these specific mountains or different mountains, what Cheyenne looked like, whether she had ever been on a boat, what her favorite color was, what she thought about when she was quiet. She answered all of it. She found she liked answering. The questions reminded her that there were still parts of herself she hadn't had occasion to use in a long time. James was quieter than his brother, but no less attentive. He was the one who started leaving things for her, a flat stone he'd found by the river, a dried wildflower, once a small drawing of a horse done in charcoal on a torn piece of paper. He left them on the table beside her coffee cup in the mornings and never mentioned them and never looked at her when she found them. She kept every one. Henry began stopping to talk to her when he came in from work in the evenings. Not long conversations, but real ones about the ranch, about what he was learning, about the way he thought about the land, and what he wanted to do with his life when the ranch was his to consider. He had ideas that were bigger than Dylan, and she listened to them without condescension and asked questions that took the ideas seriously. And she could see from the way he started talking to her that very few people in his life had done that. She was not trying to replace anything. She was just trying to be present, which was, she was learning, its own kind of work. The evening of the first hard snow, Elias came in early. This was unusual enough that she looked up from the stove. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was also unusual. He generally stood when he came in, as if sitting committed him to something. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table, and then he said, "Thomas told me what you did. In the storm." She kept her attention on the stove. "I just went to get him. He said you stood in the rain with him for a good while." "The rain wasn't so bad," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She heard the snow beginning against the kitchen window, soft and insistent. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. He started again. "Margaret used to say the ranch didn't need more hands. It needed more heart." He turned the mug slowly. "I thought that was the kind of thing people said. I didn't know what it meant." Clara turned from the stove and looked at him. He was still looking at the table. His jaw worked briefly, and then he looked up and met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt that he was actually seeing her, not the woman who cooked and cleaned and occupied the room off the kitchen, but her, Clara Holt, with her notebook and her questions and her willingness to stand in the rain. "I haven't been fair to you," he said. "You came a long way on very little." "The letter was honest," she said. "I knew what I was coming to. That's more than most would say." She put his supper on the table and sat down across from him, which she had never done before. She had always eaten after, or standing at the counter. He looked at her sitting there and said nothing, and did not reach for his fork right away. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest. "Tell me something about yourself," he said. It came out a little rough, like a skill he'd let go rusty. "Not the ranch, not the boys, something about where you came from." She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him about Cheyenne, not the facts of it, but the feeling of it, the smell of the stockyards in summer. The light on the plains in the early morning, the way her mother used to sing while she hung laundry, off-key and entirely unbothered. He listened with his whole face, which she was learning he only did when something had his real attention. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I've never told the boys enough about their mother." "Maybe you could," Clara said. He picked up his fork. The snow pressed at the glass. Somewhere upstairs, one of the twins laughed at something his brother said, and the sound of it moved through the ceiling and through the kitchen like something returning that had been gone for a while. December brought the hardest cold, and with it a rhythm that Clara had not expected, something that felt around the edges, like a life. She and Elias did not become romantic in the way that stories usually mean that word. There were no grand declarations. The frontier did not lend itself to that. But small things began to accumulate. The way snow accumulates each piece so light it seems like nothing, until you look up and the whole world has changed. He started sitting at the table after supper, instead of going directly to his ledgers. He started asking her opinion on things, the timing of the cattle sale, whether she should buy more cattle, or whether she should keep the whether to hire a third hand for the spring, what she thought of a letter he'd gotten from the county land office. He asked as if her opinion was a thing he actually intended to use, which she found, after years of opinions ignored, almost startling. She started leaving his coffee ready when he came in from the early barn work, and he started leaving her lamp oil when he noticed she'd been up late reading. These were not large gestures. They were the vocabulary of people who don't yet have the words but are beginning to learn them. On Christmas Eve, the five of them sat around the table for the longest dinner Clara had eaten since she arrived, the boys telling stories she'd never heard, Elias filling in the ones they got wrong, the whole history of the ranch coming out in fragments and laughter, and the occasional argument about whether something had happened in the spring or the fall of a given year. She sat and listened and laughed when the stories were funny and asked questions that opened the stories wider, and at some point she realized that nobody was treating her like a guest anymore. When the boys went to bed, she and Elias sat by the wood stove with the last of the coffee, and the house was quiet around them in the particular way that Christmas Eve is quiet when children are upstairs. He reached across and put a small paper package on the table in front of her. Inside was a leather cover for her notebook, hand-stitched, with her initials pressed into the front. She looked at it for a long moment. "I asked a man in town who does leather work," Elias said. He was looking at the stove. "You're always writing in that thing." The cover was getting worn. She ran her thumb across the initials. She could feel that he had described them carefully to the craftsman. They were exactly right. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough, but it was what she had in that moment, and he accepted it the way he accepted most things she gave him quietly, and with the full weight of his attention. He looked at her then, in the firelight, and she looked back. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I should have said it before now. I'm not." He stopped. Started again, in the careful way he had. "I'm not easy to be around. I know that. The boys know it too. You're worth the effort," she said. It came out plain, and she meant it plainly. Something shifted in his face that she would think about later, a settling, like a house after a storm, finding its true position. Spring came late that year but arrived decisively, the way Montana spring does, as if it's been building pressure behind a dam, and then all at once the ground is soft and the river is loud, and the hills are green so fast it seems impossible. 2 years later, though, the story doesn't need that long to tell what it became. The Double C was a different place, not in its acres or its cattle count or the structure of its buildings, but in the way it held the people inside it. Henry had started talking about going to study agriculture at the State College in Bozeman, and Elias had listened to this without flinching, which was not a small thing for a man who had been counting on his oldest son for the ranch. Clara had been the one to ask Elias if he'd considered that letting Henry go might be what kept him tethered to the land long term, and Elias had been quiet for 2 days and then sat Henry down and told him to apply. Thomas had become, without quite announcing it, her most reliable ally in the house. He kept her firewood split without being asked. He was the one who noticed when a hinge on the kitchen door had come loose and fixed it before she had to mention it. He still had his father's silence, but it was a different kind now inhabited rather than barricaded. The twins were 10 and were relentless and wonderful and exhausting in equal measure, and James still left things beside her coffee cup in the mornings, though lately they had become more elaborate, a sketch of the ranch from the hill above it, careful and detailed, and surprisingly good for a boy his age. In the late spring, when the wildflowers came back along the river, Elias came in one afternoon and found her at the kitchen table with her notebook, and instead of going to the window with his coffee, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put something on the table between them. It was a letter. His handwriting, the same careful, functional hand she'd first read in Cheyenne. But this one was not functional. It said, "In the way of a man who has had to relearn how to speak from the chest, I have not known how to say this in person. I am not sure I am saying it right even now, but I think you should know that this house is better for you being in it. Not because of the things you do, though you do them well, because of who you are in it. I would like you to stay, not as an arrangement, as a choice." She read it twice. The second time told her everything the first time had already said, and she read it a third time because sometimes a person needs to confirm that something good is real. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention he had, full and steady and slightly braced, like a man waiting on weather. She put her hand on the table, flat, close to the letter. He put his on top of it. Outside, The river was running high with snowmelt, and the hills were the deepest green they'd been all year. And somewhere on the property, two boys were arguing loudly about something that couldn't possibly matter, and the spring evening was coming in over the valley, over the land that had been hard and was now softening, over the double sea, which was not the ranch it had been 3 years ago, because a woman had arrived from Cheyenne on a Thursday afternoon with one trunk and a willingness to stand in the rain, which is, when you look at it clearly, not such a small thing at all. Sometimes the most transformative thing a person can do is simply show up and keep showing up, quietly, without demanding recognition or a guarantee of return. Clara didn't change the Calloway Ranch by force or grand gesture. She changed it by being consistently, genuinely herself, patient where patience was needed, present where presence mattered most. That kind of steadiness is available to all of us, and it costs nothing but the willingness to stay. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted for your entertainment and to share a small, hopeful truth about the quiet power we each carry.